Hi, I'm Max Blumenthal, and I've just sat down for 2 hours with Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega in one of his first interviews in 11 years. I'm actually standing in the presidential compound in Managua. Since the sudden outbreak of protests and violence last April, an uneasy calm has fallen over the country. President Daniel Ortega and his Sandinista government have claimed victory over what they call a coup attempt, but they now face condemnation from the U.S. and its allies, who accuse them of unleashing lethal violence against peaceful protesters.
The message is clear. The Nicaraguan people want Ortega out of power.
I spent much of July inside Nicaragua, speaking with supporters of the government and their opponents. I learned that Washington's narrative of a despised dictator mowing down unarmed demonstrators wasn't exactly accurate. Across the country, I observed widespread support for Ortega and the Sandinista movement. It also became apparent from the moment I arrived that Western media had covered up the brutality of the opposition, as well as its anti-democratic agenda. In the midst of what seemed to be a misinformation campaign, reinforced by right-wing members of Congress, I approached the Nicaraguan government for a chance to hear Ortega's side of the story. He agreed, granting me one of his first interviews in 11 years. I want to ask you to go back to the early days in April. When did you know that you were facing a coup? And what was your first move?
The first incidents took place on the 18th of April. On 19 April, we realized there was an offensive underway, a military offensive. These were not peaceful demonstrations, which had taken place earlier, and these peaceful demonstrations went on calmly, no problem. But the night of 19 April, in the different provincial capitals in the country, there were simultaneous attacks, and these were armed groups.
Did you have intelligence warnings about this?
No. No, it was a conspiracy. And in that sense, I think they did it good. It was well worked out. Of course, we knew the background to this situation. We knew who wanted to get Nicaragua into a war situation. Because when we came back into government in 2007, armed groups got together, and armed groups were formed, many of them linked to drug trafficking. And then through networks, for example, in Costa Rica and Miami, and links with the U.S. intelligence services and so on. So, of course, financing, and we knew that existed. And from then on, a campaign got underway, trying to establish that there was inside in the country an armed groups fighting the Sandinista government going back to 2007. If you look at the right-wing newspapers, you go back, there are the pictures of armed people. Of course, they were presented as patriots, and they were murdering campesinos, murdering Sandinista political secretaries, local authorities, and also attacking police stations and indeed killing police.
I want to ask you about the paramilitaries. I had the opportunity to go to Masaya, to Monimbo, and meet people who were abused by the opposition's paramilitaries, the Tranquistas. Much of this abuse occurred as police in Masaya were given an order to stay in the station. And one of the principal criticisms that you have received is for the use of paramilitaries on the Sandinista side. So I wanted to ask, do you think it was legitimate for citizens in Masaya, including historical combatants of the Civil War who fought the Contras, and to defend themselves and to defend the government they voted for?
Se trataba ya de defender la vida.
It was really a matter of defending their lives at that point.
Los golpistas armados
Because those armed that were staging a coup were hunting Sandinistas. They were on a Sandinista hunt, as it were. They would go into their homes. They were killing them, burning their homes, looting. And with the police, as you say, at the station. And I accept that it was a measure that did not really correspond to the moment that we were living. It was a measure that had been requested as a condition by the Bishops' Conference. It was, a condition to begin the dialogue was that we would put police back in the barracks. And at that point, trusting also in the Bishops' Conference, we hoped that by starting a dialogue, this would lower the number of attacks by opposition armed groups. And I therefore accepted to ask the police to stay, order the police to stay in their barracks. But then they took advantage of that to intensify the amounts of crimes they were committing. They were destroying health centers, schools, burning down mayor's offices, hospitals. I mean, really terrorism, in the literal sense of spreading terror among the population. So Sandinista families or not Sandinista who were victims of these attacks, of course, who wanted the police to come out. And it's a constitutional principle, after all. Citizens have a right to defend their lives when they are under attack.
I spoke to Commissioner Avian, and he lost many men and women in Masaya when his station was under attack for 45 days with the orders to stay inside. Would you do something differently the next time if there is a similar situation? And why did you decide that it was time to send the police out when you did?
Well, I was letting some time go by to see if the dialogue would end up in basically a ceasefire, a peace, and meanwhile, those who were holding peaceful marches could do so, and there have been peaceful marches on the part of the right. And of course, also there have been demonstrations by the Sandinistas or the population that identifies with the government, always asking for peace. There were 55 days, actually, 55 days. It was too long. Because really, it led to even more deaths from Sandinista families. And they were just being murdered and murdered. Until seeing that the dialogue was not leading to peace, that the opposition forces were insisting on protecting and covering up these acts of terror, these crimes, and they refused to condemn and haven't condemned them to this day. they would refuse to take down any of the roadblocks that they built. And many of these were places where people were being tortured, killed, robbed. And then they had these populations, basically sequestered or captured. They had, any number of trucks, tractor trailers that couldn't get through Nicaragua, and there were efforts, indeed, through the dialogue and with the CIDH of the OAS to go to some of these roadblocks and undo them, those in the Carazo area. And during these days, when the commissions went to discuss this, there would be like 10 days of discussions about whether they would or would not take down the roadblocks. And during that time, tens of Sandinistas were being killed. So we just couldn't continue, and had really no choice but to move in and take down the roadblocks ourselves.
You're speaking about a war in the streets, but there was also an information war. Many of your supporters have complained about manipulation. There's even a popular song, Mentira, about the wave of what they consider fake news. I want to play you a message that was sent by WhatsApp to millions of young Nicaraguans on April 19th, which claimed to be a recording from Upoli.
Todo ese teatro.
I also spoke to students who were in Upoli at the time, and they described a scenario totally different than what was described in that message, with explosions going off, police coming in to burn everyone alive. I want to ask you about your communication strategy in the early days. Were you too quiet?
Lucha contra Somoza.
What we lived through in the war against Somoza, the war the U.S. imposed upon us in the 80s, was the communications at the time were the media. I mean, as in television, newspapers, radio, and that gave Nicaragua, of course, a negative image, and it was part of the war against Nicaragua. When we came back to government in 2007, a short time thereafter, a movement of retirees began that didn't have, at the time, coverage from the National Social Security Institute because they hadn't paid the 15 years, they hadn't paid their full quota over the 15-year period. And when we came into government, the Social Security system was already in great difficulty. But because we're sensitive to social issues, we needed to come up with a just answer. And began to think, what could we do? How can we help these retirees? But these retirees were barely out on the street when suddenly a hashtag came out called Occupy INS, which is the Social Security Institute building, and that went viral internationally. And suddenly we found ourselves confronted by this sort of embryon of a force through the social networks that was really quite powerful, actually.
Sounds like a test run.
Sí, como una prueba, un poquito, ¿no? Para lo que iba a pasar después. And when the situation, because then the people came, young people who had been hearing this through social media came down to the Social Security Institute building, and they went into the building. And many of these were really the supporters of the very same parties and governments that had been in power in the 17 years when the retirees were not getting any money if they hadn't filled their entire quotas. And that was also the first time that the leaders of the Catholic Church got involved in a conflict of this nature, because they too went there then to the Social Security Institute and were talking with the young people who were there, and discussing also with the Sandinista young people who were there, who were in favor of the old people who needed to get some money, but were of course against the attacks the government was suffering, as though we had been against these people getting their quota. So what we did was we did incorporate them, but of course that weakened the Social Security system even more. But that was our first experience then with the kind of media you're talking about. The second serious one we had was the fire at Indio Maíz just this past March. And there it was a lot stronger even, because they had, of course, been using the social networks throughout, attacking the government on any number of issues. And so we started realizing we had better get with it and become interested in this whole social network thing and get involved so as to defend just positions. So they were very, very strong and internationalized the issue of this forest fire that the Sandinistas are destroying. In fact, put them fire there themselves, and one could see that this was being articulated with other movements here in the cities. They were obviously already thinking in broader terms. That was pointing in the direction it finally did, but no, it did not occur to us that this was going to end up being an attempted coup d'etat. We just thought it was one more battle in which they were trying to drag the government down, and they were trying to degrade the government. But I mean, we had firefighter experts here, and they told us it would take months to put it out. So that it was going to be very, very difficult to put out. And then we thought this is going to be, and of course there were international repercussions on sensitive issues such as the environment. And then it rained. It's a very, very rainy area. It rained intensely. And that was it. They couldn't continue with that banner.
But the social media continued. Do you think you responded effectively enough?
Fortalecer localmente, pues.
Well, I think we have to strengthen our networks locally. And of course with the people, with workers, young people, women, teachers, to defend ourselves and the good things, point out the good things that this process has had and done. And it is also absolutely critical to internationalize this, because they have been able to internationalize their...
I want to ask you about the international component now. Vice President Mike Pence is accused your government of killing 350 people. His numbers come from the local human rights group ANEDPDH, which is vehemently opposed to your rule and was founded in Miami. Now, according to Mike Pence and Ileana Ros-Lehtinen in Congress, if your government killed 350 people, then 100% of the deaths occurred on the opposition side. No one died on the government side, no accidents, no bystanders, and they were all peaceful protesters. Who really died and who's responsible?
Precisamente, es una información que se está
This
depurando.
is information that we are now going through very carefully, because the human rights organizations who have a clear political line, which is to attack the government, have just added everything up. So, if in these months in Nicaragua there have been, say, 200, somewhere between 200 and 300 deaths, all of them, without exception, are victims of the government, according to this narrative. Not a single Sandinista. No one died in an accident or even a car accident. Nobody died through common crime, and robbery, assault, and so on. And they don't say, victims of common crime that get thrown in there as well. How many are? In other words, there's no breakdown. They never break down exactly how many are opposition, how many are Sandinista, how many died in common crimes, and how many are citizens who are not committed to the government or the opposition, were simply victims at the roadblocks, for example, or in other places due to aggression, or situations where, for example, there was a mother who was giving birth in an ambulance. They didn't let her through, and she died, for example. So there is no breakdown. They just add everything up, and as you say, Euronews, CNN, the headline is, now there's 300 dead in Nicaragua, and the implication being that the Nicaraguan government killed them all.
There is a national obsession in my country with foreign meddling. Every night on the cable news, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. It's almost as if, Russia has hacked the brains of America. Many Americans don't know about the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the regime change arm of our government, which spent more money to defeat you in 1990 than George Bush and Mike Dukakis spent per vote. They have trained over 5,000 young people and students in this country in tactics aimed at what they call transition. And Felix Maradiaga, the main NED contact in this country, is now in Washington, where he was guaranteed $1.5 million from USAID for media, opposition human rights groups, and opposition activity in general. I don't think Americans would tolerate this in their country. Why do you tolerate it in Nicaragua? And do you plan on any measures to limit the influence of these regime change organizations?
Realmente está más que demostrado que
it's more than proven that these groups that you mention are linked to these acts of terror, acts of violence. At Upoli, this gentleman that you're mentioning, with the big, bearded and with a group of armed men behind him, and I mean, there's pictures of this, and he.
Maradiaga, you're referring to, that he was standing in a photograph with armed men.
Yes, at Upoli with a big beard.
See, yo lo vi.
Yeah. And there's some armed guy right behind him, and there are the weapons. And almost like looking like some guy from ISIS. Then, when this was denounced, because he's involved in a legal situation now, and so off he ran, shaved his beard. It was the first thing he did, and traveled to the United States. But anyway, he is involved is being accused legally, because there has to be justice here, but justice for all. And as concerns the way in which these resources come into Nicaragua, these are supposedly for works that these NGOs do, or training, as you mentioned, certain activities, shall we call them constructive activities. And then these end up somehow being used for other things, and including terrorist activities. And we are going to have to pay attention. So the way these funds are flowing in Nicaragua, so that they are used for what they are supposed to be used for. Because all these international organizations, there is agreement to protect themselves and all countries from terrorist attacks. The United States protects itself from terrorist attacks and has laws about terrorism. And then, of course, this whole thing with funding of elections in other countries, which is very much being debated, or that through the networks they come in and influence election outcomes. In this case, in the United States, the United States is very careful to not let that happen, and we have the right and the obligation to not allow that to happen here in Nicaragua, which is what has been happening thus far.
And you will not allow it from this date on? Is that what you're saying? You've connected these organizations to terrorism.
Here, we have an organization that is created to combat terrorism and money laundering. And the acronym in Spanish is UAF. And right now, these days, there's a meeting in Panama, and the advance of all our countries is being measured. These are international laws that he's talking about, that all countries are obligated practically to participate in, so that countries have laws in place to make it impossible, or at least prohibit money laundering, especially for international organizations. So the organizations that we have, or UAF, is going to have to examine from here on in everything that has to do with the financing that comes in and that is laundered and deviated from its initial purpose and used then to commit crimes, including organized crimes and including drug trafficking.
I went to the office of YEP, and Maradiaga was not there because he was in Washington. So I went to 100% Noticias because I wanted to know what the opposition thinks more and to hear them out. And Miguel Mora, the owner of 100% Noticias, was very happy to see an American reporter at his door, and he welcomed me in. And it was a remarkable discussion in which he said that he hoped that the United States would do to you what it did to Manuel Noriega in Panama. Marco Rubio in Florida, our senator, has promised a very harsh response. And Ileana Ross-Lehtinen was on the floor in the House yesterday calling for the passage of the NICA Act, very harsh sanctions. Are you making preparations for the return of war to Nicaragua? And how are you preparing to any extent for sanctions?
Primero, nosotros estamos totalmente claros, convencidos
In the first place, we are
que la política
completely clear
de los Estados Unidos
and convinced that
no ha cambiado
U.S. policy
en relación
has
con,
not changed
con Nicaragua.
in relation to
Quieren
Nicaragua.
tener gobiernos
Here,
sometidos totalmente.
they want governments that are entirely submissive to their decisions.
Y por lo tanto,
And
ellos
therefore,
siempre han rechazado la posibilidad de que
they have always rejected
retornar al
the
gobierno.
possibility that the FSLN would return to power.
Lo hemos tenido bien claro.
We've always been very clear about
Cuando
that.
vino aquí el general Colin Powell,
And when General Colin Powell
en la elección, a decirle al pueblo que no había que votar por el
was
Frente,
here practically to tell, and indeed told the people of Nicaragua not to vote for the Frente
en la
Sandinista.
elección venía
You know, so before practically every election, some big shot from the United States would come and basically, give some sort of a declaration that it was not a good idea to vote for the Frente. And when we did win then the 2006 election, we knew that the United States would do everything it could to degrade and wear down our government.
las primeras
The
sanciones
first
las tomó el
sanctions
presidente Obama.
were actually taken by President Obama.
Sanciones. ¿Movido por quién? Movido por el lobby de la
And
Florida.
basically under pressure from the Florida lobby.
Porque yo claramente que
And
en lo que es la política norteamericana,
in U.S. policy,
el lobby de la Florida
the
sigue
Florida
siendo un
lobby continues to be quite strong.
para luego ir a negociar
And
con
then
el gobierno en el Congreso.
they, off, they go to they go to the U.S. Congress and then to negotiate laws that supposedly are in the interest of the United States, but are really only in their interest. And these are laws that go against Venezuela, against Cuba, against Nicaragua, and so on. And so there was some cooperation planned, and it was called something like La Cuenta del Milenio. Cuenta del Milenio, sí. The Millennium account. And
se mantuvo la campaña fuerte desde el grupo de la Florida en el
then
Congreso de los Estados Unidos,
this Florida group basically kept up its campaign in the Congress,
lanzando acusaciones constantemente, defendiendo
constantly accusing us and defending
que en ese
the
tiempo
armed
asesinaban,
groups
están asesinando ahora
that
también,
were already
campesinos,
then assassinating
asesinaban
campesinos
alcaldes,
in
asesinaban
rural
congresistas,
areas, mayors in small towns.
muertos.
And, we're talking basically over the years, we're talking about hundreds
Cuando el
that were killed.
ejército
And
y la policía
when
chocaban
the army or the police fought them, and then some of them got killed, then the police were the criminals. The army were the criminal. Look, they're killing these poor, helpless peasants.
a esos delincuentes que para ellos eran.
And, these are delinquents who to them were patriots.
Ahí ha estado esa
So
lucha.
this struggle has been
Y luego nosotros logramos avanzar, sí, en lo que fue
ongoing.
el acuerdo
And
con
then
los empresarios.
we advanced with an agreement that we reached with our big business sector.
Trabajadores, empresarios, gobierno,
Well,
una alianza,
basically an alliance or an agreement between business, workers, and government. And of course, these business persons never were and never and are not Sandinistas. It was not a political ideological agreement. It was an agreement to strengthen the economy of the country, to generate jobs and combat or fight poverty.
con todas las condiciones
So,
que le damos a los empresarios,
with
también les damos la
all,
posibilidad de ganar
and of course, with the conditions that they were given,
más estabilidad.
they were able to make more money under better conditions, more stability, and this alliance then started to be torpedoed in Washington.
Los nicaragüenses,
And
de los ONG,
the
los políticos,
Nicaraguans from NGOs and political parties who are now involved in the coup, by the way, went to lobby in Washington, criticizing the business sector in Nicaragua for its alliance with the Sandinistas.
la famosa ley Nica.
And that is where this famous Nica Act was born.
Entonces se trabajó la ley Nica, se empezó a introducir.
And that was then introduced to Congress. We know, of course, it's been there for years, moving forward,
Y ese fue un elemento muy importante
and that was a very important element to
para crear condiciones de
to
desestabilización
create destabilization here
para el intento del golpe.
for their coup attempt.
¿Por qué? Porque provocó una fractura entre los empresarios.
Why? Because it caused a fracture among the business class.
Amenazaban con
Because
poner una lista,
they were threatening, for example,
la lista
to,
que le llaman
eh,
la del ruso, la lista Magnitsky.
on the Magnitsky Act, the global Magnitsky Act. They were threatening to put not only Sandinistas, but also some of the bigger businessmen that were allied with the government under the Magnitsky Act. So, of course, some of them decided that it was better to break the alliance, go against the Sandinistas, and applaud the application of the Magnitsky Act, while others, more serious, more responsible, who knew this Nica Act would damage the country, actually also went to Washington to lobby against the passage of the Nica Act. But as an element, it created favorable conditions for what then was later to become the coup attempt. Because the alliance was being affected, was being fractured by this. And we know that a law like this one affects really first and foremost the poor, the people, campesinos, workers, families, violates human rights. And a law such as this one also violates the agreements and norms that the U.S. operates when it's with international organizations. The United States is, for example, committed to not block programs that are intended to build schools, build roads, and so on in poor countries. And we are aware that this is a law that is not good for the country. And everything that is happening now, after all, affects Nicaragua. It affects the Central American region, and it affects the United States too. Why? Because we have been sort of a stopper regarding immigration, regarding organized crime. We've helped the United States a lot on drug trafficking, on immigration.
Has any U.S. official expressed concern to you about the lines of people seeking to get into Costa Rica and connected that crisis to the destabilization of the country that occurred since April? Because to this point, your country has not contributed to the migration crisis in the way that the countries in Central America that were previously destabilized by the U.S. have. Is there any concern in Washington about this?
Sí, efectivamente hay una tendencia de
There
migrar,
is
porque
clearly a tendency to
esta situación, esta
emigrate
crisis,
because this crisis,
todas estas actividades terroristas han generado
all these
no
terrorist
solamente
activities
tragedias
have
dolorosas,
not only
sino que también
caused
han dañado
loss of life,
economías.
which is the most painful thing, but it has many people have lost their jobs.
O sea,
The,
el crecimiento que
the,
venía
the economic growth
teniendo Nicaragua
that
es
Nicaragua
muy
had,
sostenible.
and that was
Tiene un
sustainable
impacto
and had
contra la
a
pobreza,
strong impact in terms, for example, of the fight against poverty,
creando mejores condiciones para que la población
creating
emigrara menos, buscara menos,
creating conditions meaning that
viajara
really
a
there
otros
were
países
less
centroamericanos o viajar a los Estados Unidos
immigrants and less people wishing
con el
to
desempleo
go
que
live in the United States. But
ha
now,
generado esta crisis.
with the unemployment caused by
Entonces
this
el
crisis,
desempleado va a buscar
you know,
otro
unemployed
camino
people, of course, have to go
y
find a
lo
way to make
buscan para Costa Rica, que
a
es lo más
living.
cercano,
And Costa Rica is, of course, the
y
closest,
buscan también para los
but
Estados Unidos.
also the United
Porque
States.
si antes
If
no buscaban para los
before
Estados Unidos,
they weren't trying to get
o
to the
eran muy
United
pocos los
States,
que buscaban
or
para Estados Unidos,
relatively few,
ahora
now,
seguramente que muchos
no
nicaragüenses
doubt,
buscarán para los
many
Estados Unidos.
more Nicaraguans will try to get to the United States.
Yo diría que lo más peligroso de todo esto es
And I think the most
el
dangerous
tema de la
thing
seguridad
here
y estabilidad de
is
Nicaragua,
the matter of security and stability of
que está
Nicaragua,
determinada por la paz
which is determined by
y
the
que está
factor
determinada, por lo tanto,
that
por
there needs to be
una economía
peace, there
estable.
needs to be a stable economy.
Si eso
If
intentan romperlo,
they break that,
entonces lo que van a hacer es
then
abrir
what they will
y
have
romper las fronteras
done is to break open the borders,
y abrir las fronteras entonces al narcotráfico, al crimen
and
organizado.
that will also mean the borders are open to organized crime, to drug
Ha
trafficking,
sido el punto de
because
contención
Nicaragua has been, as we call it here, the stopper. We have been the point of that contains the pressure
hacia el sur.
that comes from the north
Aquí hemos logrado
toward
contener
the south.
haciendo
And
esfuerzos combinados
here,
con
in
Honduras,
combined
El Salvador,
efforts with
Guatemala,
Honduras, El Salvador,
México.
Guatemala, Mexico.
Pero si se rompe
But
esta contención,
if that
entonces aquí va a pasar
is
tranquilamente
broken down,
el crimen organizado, el
then
narcotráfico,
organized
las pandillas
crime, drug trafficking, youth
que
gangs
ya están penetrando en Costa
that
Rica
are already penetrating Costa
y
Rica,
van a terminar ocupando también
and
Panamá.
they will end up also
Y
in
van a
Panama.
terminar entonces
And,
incidiendo en el canal de Panamá.
and then that will
Una ruta estratégica
eventually, of course, have an influence on the Panama Canal, which is a strategic route at global level. So
de toda la red del
practically
narcotráfico
the entire drug trafficking
del
network
norte hasta
from
Colombia,
the north all the
que
way
es
to
la
Colombia,
principal
which is where, of course, as you know,
producción
the main source
de
of the production of drugs is located.
The lawmakers who pushed for the application of the Global Magnitsky Act, as well as the opposition in this country, and many of your critics refer to one issue again and again as a source of criticism. They claim that you and members of your family have created personal wealth and funded the Frente through the ownership of different businesses, including by taking money from ALBA and publicly owned agencies. I'm sure you're familiar with these criticisms. So what is your response?
Bueno, el Frente pasó 17 años fuera del gobierno.
The Frente Sandinista was not in government, as you know, for 17 years.
Cada 19 de julio
And every 19th of July,
llenamos esa plaza.
we still filled the plaza.
¿Por qué dicen que ahora llenamos la plaza porque estamos en el gobierno?
Now they say we fill it because we're in
Que la
government,
llenamos con empleados públicos.
and that we fill it with public employees, employees from the public sector.
Ha sido un esfuerzo muy grande
So
para recaudar y para motivar a la
we have always worked to gather and motivate the population in the different territories and basically trying to make the party activities self-sustaining. And we participated in all the elections without being in government, and that cost money too, and we got resources to have a few ads on television, direct propaganda, and so on. So we have never been a political force that depends on the state or depends on the government, and that's the best proof. And that was how we came back to government, without getting funds from anywhere else. And here, the ALBA programs, they have helped the population, the families, with programs that are not well understood at all by the forces that are against us. Well, we have one program, for example, called Zero Usury, which is credits for small people, particularly women, who have very tiny businesses with zero interest rate, and the idea is that the program still is sustainable. We also have Zero Hunger, where we give these women in particular who have a small plot of land, animals, a cow, sow, chicken, and so on, cattle, and so on, so they can themselves become productive subjects, economic subjects in their own right. And that is something they can't understand, and they therefore make fun of these programs. What has also been invested in roads and streets in the towns. Also, sort of rest and relaxation parks for children, in part with the budget of the mayor's offices in the towns where these parks were built, for example, and partly with ALBA funds. And then, of course, there's been great benefits to Nicaragua, the relations we had with Venezuela. Why? Because it mobilized the country's economy. And the business sector certainly benefited from exports to Venezuela. No, when Venezuela still had stronger economic strength, and they were importing quite a bit from Nicaragua. And at one point, Venezuela became the second country that we were exporting to, after only the United States. And that too benefited the business sector here, and large, medium, and small. And we even started growing some food, black beans. Nicaraguans like red beans, but because in Venezuela they eat black beans, we started financing the campesinos so they could grow black beans, because then there was a secure market in Venezuela for these black beans. And the cattle ranchers too, exporting cattle, and of course the milk processing plants exporting milk. Also the sugarcane mills exporting sugar. So at some point, through ALBA, Venezuela became a very important market that really improved our economy and helped us to develop social programs.
Venezuela has also been a constant source of criticism from the OAS, where you previously enjoyed good relations with Luis Almagro, the General Secretary. Now Venezuela has left the OAS, and they've called it a colonial institution, and you, too, have been condemned, your government, by 21 members of the OAS. Would you consider following Venezuela's path?
Venezuela decidió retirarse de la OEA.
Venezuela decided to leave the OAS.
Los tiempos no se han vencido todavía, ¿sí?
The time is not yet up. It takes a while to pull out.
Plazos para el retiro y Venezuela sigue jugando un papel activo.
And so Venezuela continues to play an active role in the OSS and in the debate, as you know, no doubt, in the debate about Nicaragua, they played a very active role, as did other countries, Bolivia, for example, and other countries in the Caribbean that have a very clear position. And then other countries, of course, who are under pressures, decided to abstain when it came to voting. I think that even with the weakening of the OAS, we need to continue the fight, continue the battle, and defend our point of view. It is true, for example, that countries such as the United States, which are part of the OAS, promote themselves, for example, as great defenders of human rights. They have not ratified or signed their commitment with the OAS when it comes to human rights. But they like to talk about human rights. And these are elements that no doubt weaken the OAS. But what most weakens the OAS right now is the revanchist attitude of right-wing governments that are now a majority in Latin America and who have joined forces with the United States or are guided or directed by the United States or the Miami lobby to fight those countries that favor relations of respect to sovereignty, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and because you have to respect each country's internal policies. CELAC was possible because of the maturity of the left forces that at the time were a majority, and we really were democratic in the way we did not, for example, join together to go and attack the right-wing countries who at the time were a minority. We weren't criticizing them. We weren't judging them at the OAS. We respected them. They let them, solve their problems. Each country has problems, and so our policy was not to interfere in other countries' internal affairs, and that meant, and this is how we were able to build then the community of Latin American and Caribbean countries, and there it was, working quite well, alternating leadership in different meetings. Mexico at one point, Venezuela, another one, then Chile, then Cuba, then Costa Rica, and so on.
De repente,
And
cuando se va dando
then
el avance
suddenly, with the
del gobierno
advance
de derecha en América
of
Latina,
right-wing countries in Latin
entonces
America,
cambia la situación.
then the
Y
situation
la
changed.
CELAC ha quedado prácticamente
And now
bloqueada.
it's
¿eh?
CELAC is
Y la
practically
OEA ha sido
blocked.
tomada
And the OAS
por
has been
países
taken over
que
practically.
Y respetan completamente
They,
a sus
they,
propios pueblos.
these governments have no
Porque
respect for their own people.
Porque una
They've
acción
been,
revanchista,
by really revanchist
injerencista,
attitude
irrespetuosa,
that is not respectful, that
han
does
formado
interfere in other countries' affairs, and they've formed a bloc.
países que, bueno, si la práctica
I mean,
fuese
if the practice of the OAS were
llevar a juicio a cada país que tiene
to
problemas
judge every
de
country
desaparecidos,
that has problems
de
of
muertos,
people that are dying, people that have disappeared, people that are getting killed,
de levantamiento, etc.
uprisings that are squashed.
Recopilando
They'd be
todos los países
talking about
latinoamericanos.
that. Practically every single Latin American country would have to be
Pero eso no
judged.
sucede.
But that does not
Son
happen.
países de este
And
grupo
so
donde se cometen crímenes todos los días.
there are countries in this group where the most
Y no
terrible
hay fiscalización de
crimes
parte de la
are
OEA ni de
committed
Estados
every day.
Unidos.
And there's no oversight by the OAS, no oversight by the United States. Nobody proposes that these issues be discussed at the OAS. And this really has to do with the weakening and degrading of positions that are truly democratic, progressive, and revolutionary. I have just two more questions, and one does concern the future path. Having been around the country and speaking to people who have been abused, who are Sandinistas, they speak about direct involvement of priests from the Catholic Church at the tranques and in their own brutalization. The Catholic Church was heavily involved in the plan to remove you. Do you have a plan for dialogue? How will you manage this relationship, which seems to be totally ripped to pieces? We asked them to convoke the dialogue, and they themselves were saying, well, we don't really have experience as mediators. And in the end, the influence of the opposition and the pressure put on them by the opposition, also the communications media, made it for them impossible to work in a fair, balanced way in the dialogue. I recognize that Cardinal Brenes has been very careful in his declarations, as have other bishops. And then on the other hand, there are some who have simply broken with their role as mediator. Because from the first day that the dialogue was there, we were, and they would take the floor and clearly take the side of the opposition. And by doing so, of course, undermining the authority of the Bishops' Conference, while another was, off texting on the cell phone in the middle of this serious dialogue. And, of course, texting in favor of the opposition and against the government. And there were two bishops there then who were clearly undermining the episcopal, the bishops' conference as mediators, and nobody said anything to them, and their behavior was clearly unserious. So I would say that there was really wear and tear for them due to the attitude not of all but some
including Silvio Baez?
Incluyendo Silvio Baez.
Él que es más bueno para andar.
He's the one who's the best with the Twitter.
Yeah.
Ese estaba el día que estábamos inaugurando, instalando el diálogo, él estaba allá.
The day we were inaugurating
Lanzando
the day, he was there texting away.
Entonces,
So,
no puede ser
you know, that's not
mediador la comunidad.
that's not being.
Why don't you have a Twitter account?
¿Y por qué no tiene usted una cuenta de Twitter entonces?
¿Una?
¿Por qué no tiene usted una cuenta de Twitter?
Ah. Me volvería loco.
It would drive me nuts.
It wastes a lot of time.
Sí, y sería una pérdida de tiempo.
Sí, perdí de tiempo. Sí.
Yeah.
Entonces, yo coincido con lo que dijo el
But
cardenal Brenes.
I agree with what Cardinal Brenes said.
Lo dijo ayer
I
en
think
las celebraciones
just yesterday.
antier, en las celebraciones de los pueblos allá de Caraz.
When
Ahí celebran Santiago Apóstol, entonces
when the apostle
yo
Santiago is celebrated in one of the towns, and
hizo un mensaje que yo
he
comparto,
gave a message that the
defendiendo
president
que
shares,
tenemos que trabajar por la paz,
that we have to work for peace.
que tenemos que ir acabando con el
We
odio
need to
para que podamos
stop
vernos de nuevo
hatred so we can
frente a los
see
ojos.
each other again in the eyes, look each other in the eyes again. And that was part of his message.
Hoy lo dijo ese.
Today, okay, so it was today that he said this, and the president agrees with that statement. And
Coincidimos plenamente.
I fully agree with that. I think that's the way to go. And
Ojalá pudiésemos
hopefully
vernos nuevamente.
that will happen, and hopefully we will look each other
Los ojos,
in the eyes again, talk
de forma realmente
in a way
respetuosa.
that is respectful.
And finally, some of my older friends came here in the 1980s.
Sí.
And they wanted to show solidarity with the Sandinista movement, with the Frente. Some of them took the 1980s version of selfies with you. Today, the situation among the left in the United States and Europe and the perspective on Sandinismo is a little different. You've spent over a decade in power, your government, and you've received a lot of criticism from many quarters. And now there's a debate on the left in the West on whether your government and the Sandinista movement in general deserves its support. What is your message to the left in the United States and Europe about why they should show solidarity to your government and to the Sandinista movement in general?
Y primero, quiero reconocer y agradecer
I would like to begin by recognizing and thanking
de amigos en los Estados Unidos
our friends in the United States who continue believing in this project,
de amigos también en
and
Europa
the same,
que siguen
of
creyendo
course,
en este
friends in Europe who continue to believe in this project, who have
proyecto, que han
sent
realizado actos
messages, who have
incluso han
held
hecho,
events.
donde
There was even one,
están en Francia, en
I think,
París, en
in
Eiffel,
France at the
hay un
Eiffel
grupo
Tower, and there's this
solidario ahí, pues,
group
manifestando
of solidarity, with demonstrating, the
a
small demonstration in the support
Sandinista,
of
Sandinista.
Nicaragua and the Sandinista front.
Y a los que tienen dudas
And for those who have their doubts,
o a los que piensan pues que
or who think
ya no vale la pena
that
ser
it's
solidarios con Nicaragua.
no longer worthwhile to be in solidarity with
Yo
Nicaragua,
diría que
I would say
aquí al final de cuentas
that here,
se trata de ser
at
consecuente
the end of the day,
con
it
los principios de lo
is
mismo.
a matter of sticking to one's principles.
Y que observen bien
So please
cómo se comportan
look
sus
carefully
autoridades.
at how your authorities behave.
¿Qué derecho le da a sus autoridades
What right
de estar castigando a
do
un país
your authorities have
al
to
cual no han
punish
castigado a lo largo de toda la
a
historia?
country in a way
Estar
that they
castigándolo una vez más
have
con
not
sanciones de todo
punished
tipo.
or attacked any other country, and now are coming with a new set of sanctions, putting in practice, as they always have put in practice, a policy that interferes in the internal affairs of another country. So I would ask them to look at this elemental, at this basic principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of a country, of other countries, even if they might not be in agreement with everything that we have done or are doing. But it is absolutely elemental, absolutely fundamental and basic to defend the principle that European countries, the government of the United States, and so on, not interfere in the internal affairs of another country. You know, sometimes more, sometimes less, different ways, but we see many different signs of interference in our internal affairs.
Señor Presidente, muchísimas gracias por su tiempo, por esta oportunidad y suerte.
Gracias.